That's a microphone, so that means this is video recording. It creates great interaction, though, for situations like this.
Hey, why not?
Yeah.
My name is Brian Ward. I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel about the psychology in gaming. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to admit that as a child, I was never allowed to own a video game console. We'll get into why.
Let's talk about how traumatizing
Yeah, we'll get
that
into
was.
why in a bit. The struggle
Why
is
don't we
real.
just start that?
There's a good story
with
behind
that.
that.
But as a result, I grew up with this fascination of the gaming industry and the gaming culture, and I became specifically fascinated by the idea of retro gaming and the fact that no matter how much we progress in the industry as we get more sophisticated games, more complicated games, more storytelling, for some reason we still go back to those games that we were most comforted by and gave us the most joy growing up. And then as we get older, each generation has a different definition of what retro gaming is. So I think we've got a good group of panelists to help us investigate and explore those sorts of topics. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. He is the host of the podcast Retro Game Night. He is a screenwriter and loves to talk about all things Batman. Please welcome Damian DeCarlo. Next up, we have a Twitch streamer. He's known for his knowledge of gaming tech. He's also a co-host of Retro Game Night. Please welcome Kyle Lansing. And then we also have player 3 of Retro Game Night. Also works as an aerospace engineer and is a brainiac behind the science of gaming. Please welcome Josh Edwards. Now we're pumping the psychology into the psychology gaming. She is a clinical psychologist at UCLA. She also consults with writers of film, television, comic books, novels. You can find her in the pages in canon of Batgirl, Gail Simone's run. And she also hosts 2 podcasts. One is the Arkham Sessions, which explores every single episode of Batman the Animated Series through the critical lens of a clinical psychologist. And then also Lattes with Leia, which explores Star Wars. Please welcome Dr. Andrea Letamendi. I want to get to know our panelists just a little bit first before we really dive in. When you think back to that first moment that you picked up a console or a keyboard and were suddenly enveloped by this love of gaming, what is that memory that comes back to you?
I would say the original Super Mario Brothers for the NES. My parents bought that, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's similar to how children nowadays can just pick up their parents' iPhone and just start downloading games and just picking things up. For me back then, you pick up the controller, you somehow know how to work that uncomfortable rectangle controller, and you just figure out how Mario runs, jumps, and the rest goes from there.
Very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Rectangle controller.
When you would grab that controller, you actually get anxious about certain games, and it starts digging into your hands, and then you get imprints on it, and then you're like, ow!
Trail of blood going down.
You would create your own natural contouring just from
Yeah.
the hours of rubbing against the plastic.
Yes.
Exactly, you start getting the calluses on your hands. For me, it was just, the NES and the Sega Genesis. I remember Sonic being a big part of me growing up. Me and my brother would actually kind of get into it a little bit of which room, when we first got it, which room was that console going to go into, because it wasn't going to be out in the living room where we had the giant TV that was the old school that sat on the floor back then. So we were trying to figure out where we were going to go, and we always got into spats about that kind of stuff. But just remembering being able to go into those worlds as a young child and being able to just, Sonic was the fastest thing alive, and you could be that guy spinning around, jumping, fastest, I should say. He's a little slower than that, but it's all right. So for me, it was just those old school games, being able to play co-op with friends or my brother and being able to enjoy those times.
So Damien, we have a Nintendo kid, we have a Sega kid. You're going to break the tie.
No, I'm a Nintendo kid.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, for me growing up, Sonic the Hedgehog was number one for Sega. But when it came to NES, I would say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was my thing. So after seeing the cartoon, growing up with it, I could play this. It was a new thing there to do. So it was very, very fun.
Who was your character?
Always Raphael. Always.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of interesting because he is actually the better one statistically of all the, because he has the longer. No, Raph. Sorry, I was thinking Don. My bad.
No,
I was going to say
Don is better. Don is better than Raph.
Yeah, Donatello's
Okay,
got the bow.
I'm judging you on your choice of turtle right now. Donatello was always my turtle. So I didn't realize how lucky I was because we had a neighbor when I was growing up who was from Japan, and the family had the NES before anybody did in my neighborhood. So I would go over to their house when I was young, and we started playing Mario and Duck Hunt, and that wasn't my first exposure to video games because we had I'm going to date myself, but like we had Atari and Texas Instruments, and some other folks in this room are like, what are those things? Anyone remember any of
your
those things?
calculator
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
count
Yeah, okay.
for gaming.
I don't know if it's old now.
But there is something about Nintendo that was the kind of emergence of popular gaming. It really was this new dimension, and it was so sophisticated compared to what we had before. As a kid, I didn't understand that, but I remember like running over to the neighbor's house and playing these games, and there was something about just being immersed in it, and also like figuring out the challenge of it, figuring out how to make certain jumps and predicting the different moves and understanding the landscape, and so there's a lot there, I think, that shaped us as far as gaming goes.
I want to know a little bit about the podcast, Retro Game Night. Damien, Kyle, Josh, tell us why you chose to do the podcast and how it is you go into these stories recounting your past in gaming.
One story I frequent is the story of a friend of mine that was playing an old school game and talking about all the great memories he was having while playing it, and we just got together to do like a game night. He started getting emotional when describing his life, what it was as a kid, and how drastically it changed as an adult, and I think that's when I kind of knew that I wanted to talk about what that is, that memory that goes back to the warm and fuzzy days, and with a world where the climate's sometimes getting darker and darker, it's nice to be able to go back to something that you revisited at a golden age. So then we got together and started doing game night, and then just started doing a podcast where we could just talk to people, because we talked about it so much that we thought, why not talk to everybody else about it?
Yeah, me and Damien have secular work where we were allowed to always just kind of be on the phone talking with each other almost all day. And really, it always diverged away from work and more of, hey, this new thing is coming out. Hey, these games are coming out. Or when the Switch started coming out again with the old console, with the NES, the emulators that they're putting out on there, the old games that were coming out. We're just like always going back to that topic. And at the end of the day, I mean, we'd be talking 3-4 hours. And
At
it would
least,
be,
yeah.
and it would be just pretty much all about gaming. And he's just like, we should record these and just put them out there, just because someone will resonate with us of just our feelings and the nostalgia of those games and what it always went back to and how our life was. And so we just decided to take that when we get together. We at first tried to do a little bit of a video podcast while we were playing the games, because when we all got together, we made it a point to beat that game that night, no matter what it took, especially because there were old games of ours that we never got to beat before. So we would go back to it, spend as much time as we needed to beat that game, and then could kind of recount our experiences, the snacks that we used to eat when we would play these games, the friends that we had, the conversations or the feelings of it. And we just wanted to capture that and put it out there for people, just because we talk about it so much.
So is that like Cool Ranch Doritos? What are we talking here?
I remember being able, the Reese's, what are those square marshmallow Rice Krispie treats? There used to be a cereal back in the day of Rice Krispie treats cereal. I can never find it anymore, and I'm bummed about it, because that would be this thing that I would always be able to snack on when I was playing. those games. Or, Lucky Charms, just eating the marshmallows out.
They hurt your teeth, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there was one, I remember there was one night where we had the special Oreos. Remember those ones?
Oh, when you say special Oreos.
Oh, yeah.
Really good.
Hey, let me
Let me
clarify.
specify. I'm trying to remember. That was the pumpkin pie flavor. I
No,
believe.
carrot cake.
Oh, no, it was the carrot
Like
cake.
carrot
Yes.
cake. And I still go back to those right now.
Yeah. As for me, I actually came in a little bit later. Damien and I have been friends since we were teenagers, but we just kind of split apart a little bit after a while. No issues, but just, a busy life. And he called me up like, "Hey, have some friends that come up by, go through some old games. Why don't you come on over?" And with my busy job, I was very happy to kind of get a little bit of a release, and my wife was very understanding with that. So she was very wonderful about that. And so I just started joining the guys, and we started knocking out some of these games that, frankly, have been torturing the back of my mind for years and years. I remember my grandparents have a cabin in Big Bear, and they have an old NES system there, and they had some games. And because they weren't mine, I could only play them when I was up there. And so it was really nice to be able to go back and on an emulation with some cheats actually get back to those, because some of them we found out you were not meant to beat these on the NES. There's this one little motorcycle game called Thundercade, and I actually did eBay the cartridge later on when as an adult, and played through it, and I got through about halfway through the second stage out of 4. Well, by the end, there's turrets flying all over the place by the 4th level. If you had to translate lives into quarters, we probably dropped at least $100 worth of coinage into that, beating that game, because there's no way you would have been able to beat it otherwise.
Easily $100.
Yes.
So you're game genieing the game and just making sure that you've got enough.
Yeah, well, at least on the game night when we did it, we would
Yes.
put cheats because the goal was to finish it no matter
Yeah.
what.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's gamers out there gonna be like, "Oh, don't do it that way," but we didn't care. We just wanted to make it a night. That's why we call it retro game night. We want to finish that and have a pick for the next one.
So, Drea, we're talking about these games that tortured us. This is where you come in.
Oh,
You spend a significant amount of time analyzing comic books, movies, television, and these characters. What is the difference between those mediums and gaming, especially when it comes to we, the audience, and our love of these characters and games?
well, there's certainly more of an interactional experience with this. As you're forming a relationship with the game, each iteration is kind of a layer upon layer of your just the building blocks in your brain of what this game means to you. So I always think about gaming as more dimensional in terms of what it means to us, not just personally, but neurobiologically. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different functioning per se in our brain when we're interacting with a video game. Not to say that when we're reading a comic book or a novel, there are other interactions happening, but here you can impact what happens in the game. And so your decision making and your hand-eye coordination, which is extremely important in this process, adds into the experience. And I was also asking about food, not just because I was interested in Cool Ranch Doritos.
But you are.
And what was it like?
Those are delicious,
What was
though.
that Pepsi? That was. Did you drink that clear Pepsi for a bit?
No.
I feel like that was.
I remember that.
remember.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
trust
Yeah.
any Pepsi that's clear.
Anyway.
I want to know.
Not
I wanna
enough
know-
color.
So it's I want to say two things. One is that what we're doing while we're gaming, the experience of that is really important, and taste, sound, and smell all are kind of fundamental aspects of memory. So if you're going back and you're playing a game that you used to play as a kid, you might actually be conjuring up or like thinking about the different aspects of that, the food that you were eating, the experience that you had in the full sense of that. And if you even start to like eat the foods, like try to find that clear Pepsi, but eat the foods that you were eating, that can actually enhance your memory of that gaming experience. And it really harnesses the positivity and the feeling, like the feel-good experience that you have with gaming.
But you're not, I mean, some of these things like the Rice Krispie cereal, you can't find anymore. The clear Pepsi, you can't find anymore. It's not that you have to have all of those
No.
elements to complete that experience.
No, and the second thing I was going to say was certainly the emotional aspect of this and feeling that not only are you enjoying the experience, you have maybe like serotonin and dopamine boosts in your brain, you have people that you're playing with, and so you're sort of like, there's this sort of community building aspect to it. But most video games have this aspect of learning and challenges. So as you're going through the game, and I know there's different types of games that we might talk about, but with these like retro games especially, there's the process of leveling up, of trying to get to the big boss, right? So this aspect of determination, perseverance, tolerance, patience, these are actually really good for us in terms of our development of our brain. So, if it isn't clear, I'm saying that video games can actually be good for us.
That brings me to my story. So I was not allowed to have, my parents put an NES on layaway at JCPenney for Christmas. And then a child psychologist, one of your folks, wrote.
We don't claim him.
They wrote he was a syndicated columnist in the paper, wrote an article about how video games were possibly the worst possible thing you could give to your child, for any number of reasons, all of which have been disproven in the years since. But they instantly went to JCPenney and took it off a layaway. And I remember Nintendo even got in touch with this guy and gave him was it the gamepad? It was the one that came with the Olympics. The
track
and field.
Yeah.
And he ended up taking that and donating it to like an addiction center. And I'm like, oh, so the games are okay for them, but it's. I want to talk about the positive stuff, especially now that we've got a clinical psychologist on the panel. I want to talk about the positive aspects of gaming, what it's done for you guys, what it can do for other people.
I always feel like it's a positive thing for me. It's always a way to, certain people have their different hobbies that they can escape into from their life of their work or what's going on around them. And for me, I always feel like it's nice to be able to have that console, whatever it is, or even your phones right now, to be able to escape into a world for a little bit, kind of de-stress my mind about what's going on, be able to even helps me process because of sometimes the repetition of certain levels, and being able to have confidence in my skills that I'm able to complete this platforming section and move on and actually complete a task that's set out in front of me, gives me a little bit more self-confidence in myself at that point, distresses me a little bit, and lets me know that I can actually do this part and keep moving forward.
You talked a little bit about in your panel yesterday, or maybe you and I talked afterward, Andrea, regarding having an outlet when and how healthy that is. And I think for me personally, having that outlet as a child, when I was not playing outside, I would play games, but it was just that spark of just being able to take my problem-solving skills into a game, have a results-oriented, process, and I would feel much more rewarded at the end of the day. Even if I didn't win the game, it was just something that felt like, okay, that's a work in progress. It felt good at the end of the day. I did something productive.
Or even when you have the challenging levels that you haven't been able to beat, you have a hard day, and you take that kind of emotions and you put it into the game, and then you're able to get past that one point, and you're just like, yeah, I finally got to be able to do it. It's a nice
Save.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Write down that password.
And even more recently, well, maybe not so much recently, but to help clear my mind at work or from work. Sometimes I juggle 20 different tasks in a day, but sometimes there's days where you just focus on one thing, and you're so focused on that throughout the entire day. There have been some nights where I'll wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh no, I need to complete this task. Someone's waiting for me right outside the door. I'm like, wait, I'm in my bedroom. What? And so in order to prevent that, sometimes what I'll do on really hard days where I'm focused on a singular task, I'll go ahead and fire up Minecraft. And I'll just kind of just start on a creative project and just try to do anything to kind of clear my mind from all the tasks that I did during the day so that I don't focus on that in my dreams while my brain's trying to defrag everything that came across the day.
Defrag, I like that.
Yeah, old school.
There's a relatively well-known movement called mindfulness, and mindfulness has been around for a very long time. But I think that as psychology and well-being have become, I think in a good way, more recognized and infused into the workplace, infused into places like this, Comic-Con, we find that mindfulness is an area. It's like a domain of well-being and a domain of interest for a lot of people. And mindfulness is essentially the practice of taking moments to look inward, to pause, to essentially do what these folks are talking about, like be present in the here and now, try to look inward and focus on the self. And what I find is that when we were playing Tetris as kids, this was mindfulness, especially for a lot of us who have very active brains, who would get distracted, who would maybe even experience stress and anxiety. So the process of just focusing on one thing and being present in the here and now, not forecasting or worrying about the future, not ruminating about something in the past or being hard on ourselves. We're just sort of taking all of our mental energies and focusing on one particular visual but very brain activating task. And I think that that's why a lot of us who played these games as kids find that as we do it as adults, it can be very therapeutic for us. Brian and I discovered maybe a year ago, VR Tetris. And I was worried that it would be today, like a 2019 version of Tetris, like just crazy, different
Lights and
shapes
lasers
and the
going on.
yeah, and since it's VR, I thought you would be like underwater and like all the shapes were like all behind you and you had to do all this stuff. But what I love about this game is that they preserved the original shapes of Tetris. They preserved the primary task. There wasn't anything, like enhanced about it. It's not as if like after you get certain lines, then it like 3D, it shifts and like moves around. It is exactly what Tetris is, but the surrounding images and the surrounding movement, that's the VR element. I don't know if you have a better way to describe this. And it's, the music is very uplifting and sort of,
Damn catchy.
it's very catchy, and you sort of get lost in this.
Yeah.
And I would say that one of the reasons why I like playing that game, even though I have like a phobia of VR, I think I'm going to get trapped in the VR system or something. I
She
don't know
literally
what
thinks
that's about.
Tron is going to happen.
I refuse to play VR by myself in the house because I'm worried.
I won't do it either.
Am I going to get into this? I worry about two things. One is that I'm in the VR system and someone breaks into my house.
Yeah.
Two, that I will get trapped in the VR. Never, no one will know.
Let's talk about this, Doctor.
Am I trapped in the VR right now? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, I don't think I've had that feeling before.
Really irrational belief. So, but going back to the Tetris game, I think that's why a lot of us go back to some of the features that we used to love as kids. So Broforce is another game that we discovered, and I loved it because it is, back to that scrolling type
Contra.
of game, and isn't, it's pretty simplistic, but is very nostalgic with all the different characters and aspects of the characters, and I thought it really kind of infused all the things that we loved growing up.
Well, I want to ask about that. I mean, as we mentioned, the idea that retro gaming evolves as the generations go on, and now you've got a game that is like Broforce, playing on the nostalgia of Metroid and Contra. Is it possible for generations coming up to experience the same sort of nostalgia we do when we go back to those games?
I would say so. I mean, we can see it even now with the recent release of Link's Awakening on the Switch. There's a lot of factors that come up a lot of themes, a lot of different gameplay options, and that's one of the topics that we discuss on the podcast. It's not always just talking about an NES or Sega Genesis game, but we actually talk about how a lot of the things that really got us, really into a lot of these games, a lot of those features we're still seeing. There was actually a game that Kyle just recently got into called Octopath.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing just a little bit of retro game research, and come to find out, there was actually a game that was only released in Japan. It was called Live Alive, and it was pretty much the same concept, but this was this SNES. So there was a game, even before we realized that it was a retro, aside from the style, this was a game that had already existed about 10 to 15 years ago, and we're reusing the same themes because there's something special about them. And it's simplicity, but also just how catchy it is sometimes. They don't all have to be huge Final Fantasy epics. I mean, those are wonderful and I love them, but they don't always have to be. It can be something a bit more simple and something you could just dive right into. And that's a lot of what we research on.
And it's also nice what Josh was saying about with Octopath and then Live a Life is the fact that since I have that kind of desire to go back to those retro, I hear that, and we have the ability now to be able to put emulators on things to be able to go back and play those older games on the newer stuff or even on our phones. That actually makes me want to go back to that game, try to find that and play it, because Octopath is a newer game that just recently came out, but it's all 16, 32-bit, like it's nice colors and all that, but it's still all the pixelated imagery, and that to me just draws me because of the retro gaming aspect of it. So the newer games that are coming out that take their art style from retro actually can spark inside people to go back to find out the roots of those games, where those games came from, how they came from this one game to the next, and see how they developed through. That's always fascinated me is where things started and how things progress through time, and how the building blocks are and what the changes have been throughout the time.
And in a lot of ways, they end up staying the same, just like with the Tetris music.
Yeah.
There will be small variations, just like with every Legend of Zelda game in the series. Yeah, they all have their differences, but when we hear that theme, even if it's a little bit different, if it's a variant for one game or another, we hear it and we instantly recognize, oh, this is a Legend of Zelda game.
What is retro in the context of gaming?
Here we go.
Okay,
Because
I was ready for
I
this
thought
one.
I knew. I'm sorry, it could have been one of your questions.
What is retro in the context of gaming?
I'll start off.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
You're gonna back me up here.
All right.
So on the podcast, we had to find a way to have a range of what we were going to cover. Where to cut it off, where to start. I probably wouldn't have said this a year ago, but we ended up deciding kind of unanimously, I think.
Yeah.
that
Almost.
almost. PS3 and Xbox 360 may go into retro. And the only reason why I decided personally to pitch that to them in the podcast was the fact that a lot of remasters are happening, a lot of remakes, and what happens to the old version of that? Do we throw it away? No, it's a classic. And I would say maybe classic and retro could fit together. And so we kind of covered that as far as being the cutoff. Starting point, we did, I think we agreed on Atari 2600.
Yes.
Nothing earlier than that, because there were other games on Mac and on PC or other systems or computers,
DOS.
on DOS. But we decided to start it with Atari because there's not really much to said with those other ones before, as far as covering it history-wise. So within that, I think with our podcast, it worked to have that range of what we consider retro.
And this was something that, again, my wife helped me out with, in that, like with clothing, you have vintage clothing, which is older clothing, but then you have retro fashion, which is reusing older styles. And in the same way, we do kind of lump everything together, because we're looking at the bigger picture. Now, we play a lot of vintage games, we play a lot of NES, a lot of these games that are, 20, 30 years old. But that same style we are continuing to see throughout certain series like the Mega Man series, through the Mario Brothers series, Legend of Zelda. We see those same styles keep coming up in newer generations of games. So every single console that we see, there's versions of previous games that we're seeing a lot of those same features, the music coming back, the gameplay, the styles of games. We're seeing a lot of that continue on. And so when we talk about retro gaming, we cover almost the entire spectrum, because you could even say the new Link's Awakening is a retro game, because what did they do? They took a game from the early 90s, or I think it was early 90s was the original, and they redid it. It's now in, was it 2.5D?
Yeah.
Beautiful coloring, everything, and they added new features. But when you get down to it, the core is still that same game.
Yeah, I've looked back on Link's Awakening specifically just to see what the differences were between the two, to see if they've changed anything. And literally, it's pretty much a carbon copy of the original Game Boy game that came out. So it's really nice to be able to see developers keep those core games, those ones that actually make you feel like you are playing the original game, but with newer, updated graphics and on a console that you're able to take with you again, which is really awesome to be able to do. So.
I'm also fascinated by the cyclical nature of not just the gaming world, but the environment around it, and how very similar to film, very similar to music, it gets the brunt of blame occasionally, especially if some horrific event happens and they go, well, that person owned this copy of this game, and now it must be that game. I want to know your thoughts, but then, Doctor, I'd like to know your thoughts as well about video game violence and how it may or may not affect society.
I really do think that the rating system for games that are out right now aren't taken very seriously, just for the fact that a lot of people still feel like, oh, games are for kids. If it's a game that's coming out, they can just go ahead and play it, but they don't actually pay attention to that a game is mature, or a game is for teen, or for everybody. But realistically, what it comes down to is just like what you said with any types of books, TV, movies, and including video games. Parents just need to be a little bit more attentive that these games, you're not just listening to it, you're not just watching it, you could be interacting with it. And for a younger child, I mean, I've had personal experiences in a GameStop where there's a 10 to 12-year-old, and a parent is buying them the next Call of Duty game, and it's just like, and they have to check ID and to make sure, because I've seen them deny people from buying those games because they weren't old enough for them. We wouldn't want a 10-year-old walking in watching a rated R movie. So the type of media that they consume, it's not going to be the only factor that will say that, oh, they played this, so it means that they made this action. I mean, there was a shooter that went around and killed a lot of people, and the media just blasted out there, oh, he played video games. He always played video games. And yeah, he did have some more violent video games that he played. And they said, oh, he was playing these games for 10 hours a day. But if you actually look at the investigative report, they say that his game that he would always go down, spend all of his money on, he was known to be there, was at an arcade playing Dance Dance Revolution. That's not a violent video game. You're standing on there dancing around on a pad. I mean, I love that game. But it's not having that effect. I think they're just using it as kind of a scapegoat to be able to say, oh, if we just blame it on this, because no just horrific action can just happen in society without a cause. But if you get rid of those games, it's not going to solve anything. It's just a single factor in those events.
Yes, and not to make light of any of the tragedies that have happened, but when you really take into account the hundreds of thousands, or maybe even up to over 1 million copies that are sold of many of these games, and when you try to compare that, well, those are anomalies. That is not a trend. That's not something you can lock in and blame. I'm not the psychologist here, but there's so much more to the human mind than even just the video game. It's how we were raised. I mean, every single person in this room is a completely different person, and it's all based on how we were raised. How were we raised by our parents? Were we in a broken home? Were we possibly abused at home. Maybe we were bullied in school, and maybe we were in a hopeless situation. And in other cases, maybe there was something, wrong with us, that maybe something wasn't addressed. There's so many factors to the human mind, and you really can't, pinpoint something just like a game or a hobby as to the makeup of a person. Now, as for me myself, I don't really play hyper-violent video games, but that's my choice. I don't know if that, will do anything to my brain, but just for me, conscience, I prefer not to. That's just me.
Yeah, I'll agree with more of what Kyle was saying. I feel that it's more of the person, and I feel that there's a lot involved, I think, personally, with judging just one sole action based off of one sole activity. I think there's a lot to be said as to how they were raised, what's their mental state when playing those games, because I think we can all say that when playing certain games we're in a certain mind frame, and then certain other kinds of people are in a different one altogether, where it could be harmful for them to take in and consume. And I feel that that's something to be careful of, and to really make some sort of awareness of, to somehow monitor in some way. But I think the rating system is the best thing that video games can have at the moment.
Right. No. I do think everyone is addressing what's important here, which is the complexity of something like predicting mass violence. We are not, as a society, really good at that. And so, I agree that if we could blame violence on one piece of art or media, it eases our mind a little bit, and the connection seems quite clear. I could look at all of the features of the mass shooters and say, like, how about just being male? Does that predict mass violence? And of course, the answer is like, no, of course not. But that's, to me, as silly as looking at one factor and saying that is the singular factor that predicts these kinds of antisocial behaviors. What I will add are a couple of things. One is that in terms of the complexity, it's true that some folks are drawn to games that might have hyperviolence involved in it, and so that might be a feature that should concern us. Is somebody going toward these games because they seem fun to them, or is there another aspect, some fantasy there that they're acting out? The important thing to look at is how that fantasy behavior is leaking into their non-gaming behavior. And if you start to see acquisition of weapons, threatening notes, some of that behavior kind of mirroring the behavior in the games, then yes, of course, we should be concerned with that. The other thing I think is important and responsible of us to mention is that in some of these hyper-violent games is also the objectification of women. And so the combination of violence and objectification of women is really dangerous territory for us and for the people, especially the people that are drawn toward those games. While those games won't necessarily directly predict behavior, I do think games can impact our beliefs and values. And so if someone is spending a lot of time with narrative, and more sophisticated games now, I know this is a little bit of a detour from retro gaming, because playing Sonic might give you some sense or some beliefs that maybe you should collect rings. I don't know, but as games become more realistic and we start to see cultures within these games and trends and certain behaviors within these games, I don't prefer games that demonstrate or portray women as submissive, as victims, and as not human, people who don't have the agency that the men do in the narrative. And I think those games are particularly worrisome for me because of the types of beliefs that people may start to acquire if they're overexposed to that kind of narrative.
I want to open it up to questions, if anyone has any about the podcast, about gaming in general, psychology. If anybody has any. Yep.
So growing up, I also was not allowed to play video games or have any systems or anything like that. But I would like to align my interests more with my
I'm gonna let them take care of that one because apparently I'm failing on that.
Well, for me, I tried and I only partially succeeded. I did try to get my wife to play the original Super Mario Brothers, and she couldn't make it past the first level. So I kept moving forward. I tried Super Mario Brothers 3, that didn't quite work out. And I did eventually get to the Super Nintendo with Super Mario World, and she was okay with that, but I couldn't get her to really get into it. I actually did get her going through the first Kingdom Hearts game, and she didn't complete it, but she got right to the final boss. She refused to power level enough to beat him, but I do give her credit. She went through all those Disney worlds. She made it.
You can't go wrong with Tetris. I mean, that would be your best bet for a start. Very addicting, catchy tunes. If outside of that, I would probably venture to Sonic the Hedgehog because it's just basically one control, one button. That's a good start, I would say. And then from there, you can kind of find your niche as to what kind of games you want. If it's platforming, if it's role playing, if you want more of a submersive story, then go outside of those two.
Yeah, everyone's different. You have to kind of experiment and see which kind of game really just meets them, especially if they've never grown up playing video games.
Now what else to say, just for myself, maybe not necessarily for starting out with retro too, because we've also talked about in other podcasts about how difficult sometimes these retro games can be starting out, because I mean they're just, when they set a challenge in front of you and they don't hold your hand and they just go, okay, here it is, keep doing it until you gain your hand-eye coordination, get past it. But a lot of the newer games that are coming out right now, they are a lot more of, here's your objective, here's a little map that tells you how to get there, or here's like, this is the ability that you need to be able to get past this point. They kind of hold your hand more because they're trying to open it up to more of a broader audience nowadays, especially with newer games coming out. So for anybody who is looking into wanting to get into some games, and then always have it in your mind too, to go to see the building blocks of where those games started, and find the joy in in just the history of certain things. And if you enjoy that game that much, you can always look back at how it came about to now. And even speedrunning right now is a big community in gaming. They even have giant they're called Games Done Quick. They have it's a big thing that they do for like raising awareness and raising funds for cancer and different charities that they do. But there's giant communities out there that people can get together with. But just starting out, I would say look at something more modern and seeing if that sparks an interest in a type of game, and then going back and seeing where it came from.
And I would say check out our podcast, because I mean we talk about so many genres that we do our best to describe each one for who likes it, and then we do our live show at a brewery in the LA area. At that point then we connect with the community to see what they like. We talk with them, and it becomes very broad as far as the choices and what you can do. There's just so much to choose from.
We're in the LA area. What brewery is that?
It's Five Threads Brewery, and it's in Westlake Village. We do the show once a month there. We do a Q&A part, and then we give out prizes, which is great because then it brings all the community involved, and everyone has a good time.
Cool. We even do, like he said, Q&As, just like what we're kind of doing right now with some people. So if anybody has any questions about it, we try to do the best that we can with our knowledge of it. And it's nice because we also bring TVs up there, and we also bring because they've been releasing those mini consoles for all the old retro games. So we bring our consoles there. If anybody wants to play anything, you get involved if they want to start something, or if they need help with anything like that. We're always right there, or afterwards we talk with people. So it's a fun time.
Nice. Any other questions? Sir.
So in a lot of different games, there are ones where you can choose your own character. Do you think there's a tie into, based on what character you decide to choose, what your mentality is, or where your mindset is at, based off of that?
It's kind of weird for me, and it's gonna be a little weird. It's because I don't know why, for whatever reason, and it's kind of weird. I want to hear what Andrea has to say about this, because I always start to lean towards a female character for some reason, and I have no idea why that is or why I do that. I did have one experience in a game where it was an MMO. I think it was Final Fantasy 14. and I always chose a female character. And what was kind of funny was I would always get so much attention from the male characters there, and they would be giving me stuff left and right, and I'm just like, oh, hey, thanks, all right, see you, bye, and just kind of take off. I don't know if that's
I
the
think
reason
you just
why.
answered your own question.
Is that the reason why? But I want to know if there's anything deeper down to that. But it was just something that. But even nowadays, even in a single player game, if I have the ability, like there's an older game called Fable that you're able to not only choose male or female, but good or bad. I can never go to the bad side. I always felt horrible on the decisions that you had to do for that. But I always chose a female character, and I never understood why, even just solo, why I would do that.
I think it's because you can, and
Okay.
this why there could be other reasons why we do this, but I would find myself. It depends on the game, but I think this is such an interesting question because in many ways we're able to actualize a character that isn't us, but is some version of us, and so there's this freedom there. I could be a character that maybe represents or has features that I want to embody. Maybe, if I'm playing Street Fighter, for instance, I might choose a character that is different than how I see myself, because then I have a moment psychologically to embody those characteristics, to feel empowered, to feel strong, to feel dominant, to feel like I'm seen as powerful in the culture or context of that narrative. And I don't get to do that in real life. So for me, that's kind of an exciting and socially appropriate thing to do. And so I think there's a little bit of a kind of like an escapism there, and a little bit of psychologically a way to harness features of our own selves that we may not be able to actualize in our social interactions or our social roles. And the other piece could just be escapism, like I just don't want to be thinking about myself. I just want to be immersed in this fantasy. So I'm going to be whatever beast or character or act out whatever I want, including a villain, because I just feel like it. And so there's a huge fantasy element there that I think is really healthy for us to kind of get immersed into.
Dre, last week you did a panel on sort of parasocial relationships, which is something that you've talked about on the podcast a number of times. For starters, I want you to explain what those are. But Dan Slott on the panel, writer of Spider-Man and a number of other huge books, asked you specifically, does a parasocial relationship increase when you're, say, playing a video game than you would if you were watching a favorite character on television or in a movie, because you are immersed in that character?
Yeah, so a parasocial relationship is essentially, I call it a non-delusional emotional connection with a fictional character. Non-delusional meaning I know Batman isn't real, but I've been growing up with this character, this person all my life, and I feel some kind of emotional bond. We experienced this with Infinity War. We experienced it with Game of Thrones, where we just have this emotional connection to characters and feel a real sense of closeness to them, simultaneously knowing that is a fictional experience, that it's not real. With gaming, there's an interactional piece there because you are impacting in some ways not just the landscape, but you're impacting other characters in the story. And so with some games, you're actually experiencing your parasocial relationship kind of in vivo in that gaming narrative. And I think that could, for some people, enhance, almost dial up that sense of emotional closeness. It might actually be a stronger bond with that experience.
We've got to wrap it up here, but I want to ask each of you, where can folks find you online? And certainly will be available after the panel, but tell us where you can find the podcast.
You can find the podcast if you go to the website, retrogamenightpodcast.com, and then our Instagram handle, retro_game night. We have our individual handles, but they're all connected to there. FiveThreadsBrewery.com. If you go there, you'll find the link regards to the live show. If you want to come hang out with us, have a brew and talk games and play games, we can definitely do that. Is there anything else? Or?
Yeah, I also wanted to thank, we also had, as people came in or as you were sitting down, you also got the little badge holders we got, so I wanted to give a shout out for that. It's at at luckstinkinbadges or luckstinkinbadges.com. She makes these online. You can ship them across, through the around the United States. So I just wanted to give a thanks to that and having a free gift for our people that were able to join us today. So thank you.
Andrea?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc, on Instagram, also Arkham Asylum Doc. And our podcast, The Arkham Sessions, is all about the psychology of Batman, and you can find us at Arkham Sessions on Twitter. And you can find our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
And just to wrap it up very quickly, that one game that you can't quit, that you will instantly go back to when you need to, what is it?
Super Mario RPG. Doesn't matter how it comes out, I'm always going back to it and beating it right away.
I'm still stuck on Tetris.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, any iteration.
I will say the Game Boy version of Turtles, and I even had that in that little window you could add on.
Mhm.
It was like 20 pounds. It would enhance the
magnified it.
screen. That's a really long answer to say. If that, because I put batteries in it recently, it does not work. But if that would work, I would just play that every day.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Appreciate you.
Enjoy the rest of the con.